A frantic bark ripped through the blizzard night. Ranger, the retired Navy SEAL's German shepherd, bolted past the fence, ignoring every command. Jack knew that sound. This wasn't a wolf chase. It was fear. He grabbed his flashlight and ran into the white storm. "Easy, boy. Show me. If this story touched your heart, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments so we can see how far this story of courage, loyalty, and rescue has reached around the world." Early winter twilight settled over the mountains of western Wyoming, the kind of quiet evening when the wind slid through the pine trees like a distant whisper, and the sky turned a pale steel gray above the long ridges. Snow had begun to fall again, thin flakes drifting lazily across the valley, though the air carried the heavy promise of something far stronger on the horizon. A small log cabin sat alone on a slope overlooking a frozen meadow, its rough timbers darkened by years of storms and silence. This was where Jack Sullivan lived. Jack Sullivan was a former Navy SEAL who had once spent years moving through some of the most dangerous places in the world, a man whose broad shoulders and hard-cut jaw still carried the quiet authority of someone trained for war. His hair was dark but threaded with early streaks of gray near the temples, kept short out of habit more than necessity. His eyes were steady, the kind that noticed everything even when he seemed to be looking at nothing. People who had known him before the war used to say he had an easy laugh and a calm patience that made others feel safe. The war had changed that. Nothing dramatic or visible, no scars across his face or missing limbs, but something inside him had grown quiet and distant, like a room whose lights had been slowly turned off. That was why he had chosen this place. The cabin had belonged to his father, a simple structure built decades earlier with thick pine beams and a stone chimney that still smelled faintly of smoke and cedar sap. Out here, there were no crowds, no traffic, no sudden noises that reminded him of places he would rather forget. Only mountains, wind, and long stretches of silence that most people would find unbearable. Jack did not. For him, the silence was the closest thing to peace he had found in years. The only other living creature in the cabin moved with soft, deliberate steps across the wooden floor. Ranger was a large German shepherd canine with thick, sable-colored fur and intelligent dark eyes that rarely missed a detail. The dog had once served alongside military units overseas, trained for detection and protection, and even now he carried himself with the alert composure of a professional soldier. His ears were always half raised, listening, and his gaze often rested quietly on Jack as if measuring his mood. Ranger was not young anymore, but he remained strong and steady, and the bond between the two of them had grown into something deeper than companionship. Ranger was not just a dog. He was the one presence in Jack's life that never asked questions about the past. That afternoon, Jack sat at the wooden table near the front window, slowly cleaning an old hunting rifle with a cloth that smelled faintly of gun oil. Outside the window, the sky had darkened faster than usual, and the wind had begun to rise. The first heavy gusts rattled the branches of the tall pines surrounding the cabin. Ranger lifted his head slightly, ears turning toward the sound. Jack noticed the movement and glanced outside. The clouds had thickened into a low-moving wall that rolled across the mountains like a gray tide. A storm was coming. In Wyoming, that meant only one thing this time of year: a blizzard. Jack finished wiping the rifle and set it aside. Storms out here could shut down the roads for days, sometimes weeks, but he had prepared for that long ago. Shelves in the kitchen held canned food, dried beans, coffee, and enough supplies to last for months if necessary. Living alone in the mountains had taught him to respect the weather. Ranger stood and padded toward the door, sniffing the cold air that slipped through the narrow cracks in the frame. Jack watched him with a faint smile that barely touched his lips. "You feel it too, huh?" he said quietly. The dog gave a soft huff, but did not bark. Outside, the wind grew stronger. Snow began to fall harder now, thick, swirling flakes that blurred the distant tree line. Somewhere down the mountain, a power line snapped with a sharp metallic pop that echoed faintly across the valley. The lights in the cabin flickered once, twice, and then went dark. Jack did not react. Power outages were normal during winter storms. He rose calmly and walked to the kitchen shelf where 2 oil lamps sat ready. Within moments, warm golden light returned to the room, casting long shadows across the wooden walls. Ranger moved closer, settling beside the door like a quiet sentry. Miles away in the small town of Red Creek, life moved more slowly but still carried its own rhythms. Emily Carter stood behind the counter of a tiny general store, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had already grown lukewarm. Emily Carter had spent most of her life working as a nurse at the county hospital. She was a woman with gentle eyes and silver blonde hair usually tied in a loose braid that rested over one shoulder. Her posture was straight, the habit of someone used to long hours on her feet caring for other people. Even in retirement, she carried that same calm patience that made strangers feel instantly at ease. The young store clerk beside her was struggling to close the front door against the rising wind. "Storm's coming fast," he muttered. Emily nodded, her thoughts drifting briefly to the cabin up in the mountains. She had never pried into Jack Sullivan's past, but she understood the look in his eyes the first time he had come into town for supplies. She had seen that look before in soldiers who returned from overseas carrying things they could not explain. Every few weeks, she arranged for a box of groceries to be sent up the mountain with a delivery truck. Small gestures, she insisted, were simply neighborly kindness. She suspected Jack knew where the packages came from, but he had never said anything. Outside the store window, the snow was beginning to swirl into thick white curtains. "Hope Jack's stocked up," she murmured quietly to herself. Back in the cabin, the wind had turned into a steady roar that rattled the shutters and sent snow sliding across the roof in heavy waves. Ranger had not moved from his place near the door. Jack sat again at the table with a mug of black coffee, staring into the lamplight while the storm gathered strength outside. His thoughts drifted the way they often did during quiet moments. Images of desert landscapes, distant gunfire, and radio chatter flickered through his memory like fragments of another life. He did not dwell on them long. Ranger shifted suddenly. The movement was sharp enough that Jack's attention snapped back instantly. The dog's ears stood upright, body rigid. Something had changed. Jack leaned forward slightly, watching the dog. Ranger let out a low, uneasy whine, then paced once across the room before returning to the door. Jack frowned. Ranger was trained, disciplined, rarely nervous without reason. The storm outside howled louder. Snow struck the windows in hard bursts. For a long moment, nothing else happened. Then Ranger barked once, a sudden explosive sound that filled the cabin. Jack rose slowly. "What is it, boy?" Ranger did not respond. Instead, he scratched at the door, muscles tense, tail rigid. Jack opened the door a few inches. The wind burst inside like a living thing, carrying a swirl of icy snow across the floor. Ranger bolted past him into the storm without hesitation. Jack stared after the disappearing shape of his dog, shock tightening his chest. Ranger never ran off. Never. Outside, the blizzard was already swallowing the valley in white chaos. Jack grabbed his coat and flashlight and stepped onto the porch, the wind cutting through the cold air like a blade. Ranger was already a fading silhouette racing across the darkening snow. Something was terribly wrong. The storm had grown into a violent white wall by the time Jack Sullivan pushed down the cabin steps. Snow tore sideways across the ground, stinging his face like needles. The beam of his flashlight carved a narrow tunnel through the swirling darkness, but even that light struggled against the blizzard. Ranger was already 30 yards ahead, a gray shadow moving fast across the snow-covered field. Jack pulled his coat tighter and followed, leaning into the wind. Every instinct he had from years in the Navy SEAL teams stirred awake again. The dog's behavior meant only one thing. Something was wrong. Ranger never ran blindly. The cold air burned in Jack's lungs as he forced his way through deepening drifts. The valley that had looked peaceful an hour earlier was now almost unrecognizable. Trees groaned under the weight of ice, and the snow erased every familiar landmark. Still, Ranger kept moving, heading straight toward the far fence line that marked the edge of Jack's property. Jack raised the flashlight and saw the dog suddenly stop. Ranger barked again, sharp and urgent, the sound barely audible through the wind. Jack quickened his pace. When the light finally reached the fence, he saw what had stopped the dog. At first, it looked like a pile of dark fabric half buried in snow. Then, the beam shifted slightly and the shape moved. A human hand twitched weakly against the frozen ground. Jack's stomach tightened. He rushed forward and dropped to one knee. It was a young woman. Her face was bruised and swollen, streaked with dried blood that had frozen along her cheekbones. Long strands of dark brown hair were tangled with ice and snow. Her clothes were in terrible condition. What had once been a heavy jacket was now ripped along the sleeves and shoulders, exposing layers underneath that were soaked and stiff with cold. Even in the faint light, Jack could see cuts and bruises across her arms and neck, injuries that suggested more than just a fall in the snow. Whoever she was, she had been through something violent. Ranger circled once and then lowered himself beside her, letting out a low, worried whine. Jack leaned closer and checked the woman's pulse with gloved fingers against her throat. It was faint, but steady. "Easy," he murmured, though he wasn't sure whether he was speaking to the dog or to himself. That was when he noticed the movement beneath her coat. Something small shifted weakly against her chest. Jack carefully pulled the torn fabric aside and revealed a tiny German Shepherd puppy curled against her body. The puppy's fur was mostly black with soft tan markings around the eyes and paws. Its ears were still floppy, suggesting it was only a few months old. The little animal trembled violently but refused to leave the woman's arms, pressing closer to her even while half buried in snow. Ranger leaned forward and sniffed the puppy, his posture immediately softening. The puppy responded by letting out a tiny whimper before hiding its face deeper against the woman's jacket. Jack shook his head slowly. "You two picked the wrong night to get lost," he muttered. The woman's eyelids fluttered briefly, though she didn't wake. Her lips moved slightly as if trying to form a word. Jack bent closer, but the wind carried the sound away before he could understand it. Whatever had happened out here, she was too weak to explain it now. The cold alone could kill her within minutes. Jack slid one arm carefully beneath her shoulders and the other under her knees. She was lighter than he expected, though her soaked clothing made the task awkward. The puppy protested softly when he lifted her, but Ranger moved closer and gently nudged the animal with his nose, calming it enough that it remained still. Carrying both of them back across the field proved far more difficult than the walkout. The wind had grown stronger, and Jack's boots sank deeper into snow with every step. Ranger ran ahead for a moment and then returned repeatedly, checking on them as if guiding the path home. By the time Jack reached the porch, his arms were burning and his breath came in heavy clouds. He pushed the door open with his shoulder and stepped inside, kicking it shut behind him before the storm could follow. The warm glow of the oil lamps illuminated the cabin again. Jack laid the woman gently on the rug near the stone fireplace. The puppy immediately curled against her chest again, refusing to move far from her even now. Ranger sat down beside them, his watchful eyes studying the stranger. Jack knelt beside the woman and removed his gloves. Up close, the injuries looked even worse. One cut along her temple had clotted with frozen blood, and bruises colored her jaw and neck in dark patches. The type of injuries Jack had seen before, signs of someone who had been hit or thrown around, not simply lost in the wilderness. Jack brought a bowl of warm water from the kitchen and began carefully cleaning the worst of the blood from her face. The woman stirred faintly again, though her eyes remained closed. The puppy finally crawled a few inches away, sniffing the room cautiously before returning to sit beside Ranger. The older dog tolerated the tiny intruder with surprising patience, lowering his head so the puppy could smell him. Jack noticed the moment and almost smiled. Ranger had always been selective about strangers, yet something about this girl, and apparently her dog, had convinced him there was no threat. Jack worked methodically, cutting away the outer layer of the woman's jacket so he could examine her injuries properly. Beneath it, she wore a thick sweater that had also been torn along one sleeve. As he turned the coat aside, his fingers brushed against something hard hidden in the inner lining. Jack paused. The object was small, square, and clearly not part of the clothing. Ranger lifted his head slightly, sensing the change in Jack's posture. Jack pulled a small knife from the table and carefully sliced open the stitching along the inside seam of the coat. His suspicion grew as he worked. Whoever this woman was, she had not ended up at his fence by accident. A small black device slipped from the lining and landed softly on the wooden floor. It was no larger than a matchbox. A tiny green light blinked slowly on its surface. Jack stared at it for a long moment. A tracker. The small blinking device lay on the wooden floor between Jack Sullivan and the firelight, its steady green pulse cutting through the quiet cabin like a silent warning. For a few seconds Jack simply stared at it, the instincts that had once kept him alive in war slowly sliding back into place. Ranger noticed the tension instantly. The German shepherd lifted his head from beside the girl and watched Jack with sharp, focused eyes, his ears forward and alert. The puppy, still trembling from the cold, remained curled against the woman's side, but kept glancing nervously between the older dog and the blinking device. Jack leaned down and picked up the tracker carefully between two fingers. It was compact and sealed in black plastic, the kind designed to survive harsh environments. The faint vibration inside confirmed it was still transmitting. That meant someone out there could be following the signal right now. Jack exhaled slowly. Whatever trouble this girl had brought with her, it was already moving toward his doorstep. He glanced at the unconscious woman again. The lamplight revealed her injuries more clearly now that the snow had melted from her skin. Beneath the bruises, her face showed a sharp, determined structure. High cheekbones, a straight nose that had probably been broken once before, and strong eyebrows that suggested a stubborn personality even in sleep. Whoever she was, she didn't look like someone who gave up easily. Jack turned the tracker over in his hand. "You've got people looking for you," he murmured quietly. Ranger stood and stepped closer, sniffing the device briefly before looking toward the front door. The dog's body language had changed completely. He wasn't relaxed anymore. He was watching, listening. Jack stood up. There was no time to waste. If someone had hidden a tracker in her coat, it meant they expected to find her eventually. He grabbed his heavy coat from the chair and slipped it on again. Ranger immediately moved toward the door, ready to follow. "Stay," Jack said firmly. The dog paused, clearly reluctant. Jack crouched briefly beside him and rested a hand against the thick fur of Ranger's neck. "Watch them," he said quietly, nodding toward the girl and the puppy. Ranger held his gaze for a moment before finally settling back down beside them, though his eyes never left the door. Jack stepped outside into the storm again. The blizzard had grown even stronger since he returned. Snow blasted across the ground in violent waves, erasing every footprint within seconds. The cold bit through his coat as he pushed forward across the field toward the narrow stream that ran along the edge of his property. The creek was one of the few places where moving water still cut through the snow during winter, a fast black ribbon between frozen banks. Jack crouched beside it and studied the rushing current. Then he searched the shoreline until he found what he needed, a waterlogged pine branch about the size of his arm. He tied the tracker securely to the wood using a length of cord from his pocket. For a moment, he simply watched the blinking green light. Then he shoved the branch into the current. The water grabbed it immediately and carried it away downstream into the swirling white darkness of the storm. Whoever was following that signal would be chasing it miles away by morning. Jack stood up and brushed snow from his gloves before turning back toward the cabin. The wind howled through the trees, but beneath it, he felt something else creeping through his mind, a familiar awareness that danger was approaching. The feeling was old and unwelcome, like reopening a door he had spent years trying to close. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled steadily. Ranger remained exactly where Jack had left him, sitting beside the girl like a silent guard. The puppy had moved slightly and now rested its small head against the larger dog's paw. Jack hung his coat by the door and knelt beside the woman again. This time, her eyes were open, dark brown and filled with sudden panic. The moment she saw him, she tried to sit up, but the movement sent a flash of pain through her injured side. She gasped and collapsed back against the rug. Ranger responded instantly. The big dog leaned forward and nudged her arm gently with his nose. His body language softened, the same careful behavior he used whenever Jack had one of his bad nights. The woman stared at the dog in surprise. "Easy," Jack said calmly. "He won't hurt you." She blinked several times, trying to focus. Her breathing was uneven, but the fear in her eyes slowly eased as Ranger remained beside her. The puppy suddenly scrambled up and climbed clumsily onto her chest. The woman wrapped her arms around it instinctively. "Hope," she whispered weakly. Jack tilted his head slightly. "That the dog's name?" The woman nodded faintly. She's all that's left." Her voice was hoarse, as if she hadn't spoken in hours. Jack poured a small cup of warm water and handed it to her. She drank slowly before glancing around the cabin. "Where am I?" "Wyoming," Jack answered simply. "My property." She seemed to relax slightly, though her expression remained tense. Her gaze drifted toward Ranger again. The large German shepherd sat calmly beside her, watching every movement with patient attention. "Your dog," she said softly. "He's trained." "Military K9, Jack replied. She nodded faintly. "Figures." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Jack leaned back slightly and studied her more carefully. "You want to tell me why someone hid a tracker in your coat?" The woman froze. The color drained from her face instantly. Her hands tightened around the puppy. For several seconds she said nothing. Finally she whispered, "You found it?" "Yeah." Jack's voice remained calm but firm. "And I got rid of it." Her eyes widened, relief and fear mixed together in equal measure. She swallowed hard before speaking again. "Then they'll come looking anyway." Jack waited. The woman hesitated, her fingers brushing the puppy's fur absent-mindedly. "My name is Lily Morgan," she said quietly. "And those people, they won't stop." She looked toward the door as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. Ranger noticed the shift in her breathing and leaned closer, resting his head gently against her arm. The simple gesture calmed her slightly. Lily closed her eyes briefly before whispering the words that made the room suddenly feel colder than the storm outside. "They'll kill anyone who helps me." The wind outside the cabin had deepened into a steady roar, like the distant thunder of an ocean breaking against invisible cliffs. Snow scraped against the wooden walls in constant bursts, and every so often a stronger gust rattled the window shutters hard enough to make the glass tremble. Inside, the fire burned brighter now, casting long amber shadows across the room. Jack Sullivan stood near the hearth with his arms folded, watching Lily Morgan carefully. She had pushed herself upright against the edge of the couch, though it was obvious the effort cost her a great deal. Her movements were stiff and cautious, as if every muscle protested the smallest shift. The bruising along her cheek had darkened under the firelight, and a thin cut across her temple had been freshly bandaged by Jack earlier. Her dark hair, still damp from melted snow, hung loosely over her shoulders. Despite the injuries and exhaustion in her posture, there was something unmistakably resilient about her expression, the kind of stubborn determination Jack had seen in people who refused to give up even when they probably should. Ranger remained beside her on the floor, his large frame resting against the side of the couch like a silent guardian. The puppy, Hope, had curled up between Lily's arm and the thick fur along Ranger's neck, clearly deciding that the older dog was the safest place in the room. The two animals looked oddly balanced together, Ranger large, steady, and battle-tested, while the puppy was small and uncertain, its paws oversized for its body, and its ears still too soft to stand upright. Jack finally spoke. "You said they'd kill anyone who helped you." Lily lowered her eyes for a moment before reaching slowly into the inside pocket of her torn sweater. The movement made Jack tense slightly, though he didn't move closer. After a moment, she pulled out a small black USB drive no larger than a thumb. The plastic casing was scratched and worn, as if it had been carried for days. She held it in both hands carefully, almost protectively. "This," she said quietly, "is why they're hunting me." Jack stepped closer and examined the drive without touching it yet. "What's on it?" Lily's expression hardened slightly, as if recalling something painful. "Proof." Her voice carried a mixture of anger and exhaustion. "Video files, internal reports, data that was never supposed to leave the company servers." Jack leaned one shoulder against the wooden beam beside the fireplace. "What company?" Lily hesitated briefly, as though saying the name out loud made the danger more real. "A pharmaceutical corporation called Grayson Biotech." Jack watched her silently. The name meant nothing to him, but Lily continued speaking before he could respond. "They were running clinical trials in remote communities," she explained slowly. "Experimental neurological drugs, supposed to treat degenerative diseases." She swallowed before continuing. "Except the trials were illegal. The test groups weren't fully informed, and when people started dying, the company buried the results." Jack studied her face. "And you found evidence." "I didn't just find it." Her fingers tightened around the drive. "Someone gave it to me." She leaned back slightly, her voice quieter now. "A man named Daniel Reeves." Jack noticed the change in her tone. "Who was he?" "Data analyst inside the company," Lily replied. "Early 30s, tall, thin guy with glasses and a habit of chewing on pens when he was nervous. Brilliant with numbers, but terrible at hiding stress." Her eyes drifted toward the fire. "He contacted me 3 months ago. Said he had evidence the company falsified trial reports." She paused before adding quietly, "He was scared. Said people inside the company were disappearing after asking questions." Jack's expression remained unreadable, though his mind had already begun assembling the pieces. "And the video?" Lily's voice dropped even lower. "Daniel recorded a meeting between executives and a security contractor." She glanced up at Jack again. "That contractor is Blackridge Security." Jack's brow tightened slightly. The name triggered something distant in his memory, rumors from overseas operations, whispers about private security groups who did work no government wanted connected to them. Lily continued before he could ask more. "Blackridge isn't just corporate security," she said. "They're a mercenary outfit. They handle problems companies can't solve legally." Jack finally took the USB drive from her hand and turned it slowly between his fingers. And Daniel Reeves. Lily's eyes closed briefly. Dead. The single word hung heavily in the room. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind outside seemed louder somehow, pressing against the cabin walls like a warning. Ranger lifted his head slightly, sensing the tension. Lily rubbed her hands together slowly, though whether from cold or nerves, it was hard to tell. Daniel gave me the files before they could silence him, she continued quietly. I didn't realize they had already tracked me until yesterday. Jack looked up sharply. Tracked you how? They found out I met Daniel, she replied. The moment he disappeared, they came for me too. She gestured faintly toward the torn jacket on the chair. That tracker you found was planted after they caught me. Jack's eyes narrowed slightly. Caught you? Lily nodded slowly. They interrogated me. Her jaw tightened as she spoke. I managed to escape before they realized I still had the drive. Jack glanced toward the door unconsciously. Even with the storm raging outside, he could feel the shape of the problem growing larger. And you ran, he said, as far as I could. Lily gave a weak, humorless smile. Apparently not far enough. Ranger shifted again beside her, resting his head against her knee. The simple contact seemed to steady her breathing. Jack noticed the moment and looked down at the dog. Ranger's instincts had rarely been wrong before. The storm continued pounding against the cabin. For several seconds, Jack said nothing. Then he exhaled slowly and set the USB drive carefully on the table. So, let me get this straight, he said quietly. You've got evidence that a pharmaceutical company killed people to hide illegal experiments, and the people chasing you are hired guns who make witnesses disappear. Lily met his gaze directly. Yes. Jack stared at the drive again, then at the window where the blizzard swallowed the darkness outside. A faint, uneasy feeling had already settled deep in his chest. Whatever had walked into his cabin tonight was far bigger than a stranded traveler, and far more dangerous. The storm showed no sign of weakening as the night deepened around the isolated cabin. Snow drove sideways across the valley like a white river of wind, burying fences and tree stumps beneath growing drifts. Inside, the fire in the stone hearth burned low but steady, filling the room with a warm glow that contrasted sharply with the violence outside. Jack Sullivan stood near the window, staring into the blizzard with the quiet patience of a man who had spent years learning how to read danger before it arrived. Ranger stood beside him, his thick fur rising slightly along his shoulders as the dog sniffed the air through a narrow crack in the window frame. Something about the storm had changed. It was not just the weather anymore. Jack felt it too, the same cold intuition that had once warned him about ambushes in places half a world away. Behind them, Lily Morgan remained on the couch, wrapped in one of Jack's old wool blankets. Her injuries were beginning to stiffen with exhaustion, and every movement seemed to cost her effort, but she remained awake. Hope, the small German Shepherd puppy, had finally fallen asleep curled against Ranger's flank earlier, though now the pup stirred slightly, sensing the tension spreading through the room. Lily watched Jack carefully. She had begun to understand something about him during the past hour. Jack did not panic. He did not rush. He simply observed, the way someone did when they had spent years surviving situations where a single mistake could mean death. The sudden sound of tires crunching slowly through snow broke the silence. Jack's head turned toward the window instantly. Ranger's reaction was even faster. The dog's ears snapped forward, and a deep growl rumbled from his chest. Jack moved quietly toward the front window and lifted the corner of the curtain just enough to see outside. Through the swirling snow, he spotted two beams of white light cutting through the darkness. Headlights. A vehicle emerged slowly from the storm. its shape gradually becoming visible as it rolled towards the cabin. It was a black SUV, large and heavy, the kind designed for mountain roads. The engine idled smoothly even in the freezing wind. Jack lowered the curtain again. Lily's face had gone pale. "They found me," she whispered. Jack did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked calmly to the table and picked up the USB drive, slipping it into the inside pocket of his shirt. "Stay here," he said quietly. "Don't make a sound." Ranger continued to growl softly as Jack moved toward the door. The dog's eyes were locked on the entrance like a soldier awaiting orders. Jack placed a hand briefly against Ranger's neck. "Easy," he murmured. "Watch her." Ranger reluctantly backed away from the door, but remained standing, every muscle tense. Outside, the SUV engine shut off. For several seconds, the storm swallowed all other sounds. Then the crunch of footsteps approached across the porch. 3 slow knocks followed. Calm, polite, almost casual. Jack opened the door, only a few inches, enough to see the man standing outside. The stranger looked strangely unaffected by the brutal weather. Snow clung to the shoulders of his long, dark coat, but his posture remained relaxed, almost confident. He was a tall man with sharp features and a neatly trimmed beard that framed a narrow jaw. His hair was dark, combed back neatly despite the wind. His eyes, however, were what caught Jack's attention most. Pale gray and completely emotionless. The man smiled politely. "Evening," he said. His voice was smooth, controlled, the voice of someone used to speaking calmly in tense situations. "Terrible storm tonight." Jack said nothing. The stranger extended a gloved hand slightly in greeting. "Victor Kane," he introduced himself. "I'm with Blackridge Security." The name hung in the cold air between them. Jack leaned slightly against the door frame, blocking the view inside the cabin. "What do you want?" Kane's smile remained steady. "We're looking for someone, a young woman, dark hair, possibly injured." He glanced briefly toward the surrounding snowfields as if studying the storm. "Our team lost contact with her earlier this evening." Jack's expression remained unreadable. "Haven't seen anyone." Kane tilted his head slightly, as if considering the answer. His eyes moved briefly past Jack's shoulder toward the darkness inside the cabin. That was when Ranger growled again, louder this time. The sound was deep and unmistakably threatening. Kane's gaze sharpened slightly. "You have a dog." "Service dog," Jack replied flatly. Kane nodded slowly, though the faint smile never left his face. "German Shepherd, I assume." Jack didn't respond. Kane took a step back from the door, brushing snow from his coat. "Well," he said lightly, "if you do happen to see the girl, we'd appreciate your help. She's involved in a serious situation." His voice softened slightly. "Dangerous people looking for her." Jack watched him without blinking. Kane paused again before adding something that made the air between them turn colder. "Of course," he continued casually, "our tracking equipment indicates 2 heat signatures inside this cabin." The words settled heavily in the silence. Inside the room, Lily held her breath. Ranger's growl deepened, vibrating through the wooden floor. Jack did not move. "Your equipment must be wrong," he said quietly. Kane studied him for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled again. "Perhaps." He stepped off the porch and began walking back toward the Saudi SUV. "Enjoy the storm, mister." Jack didn't answer. Kane shrugged lightly. "No matter." He opened the driver's door and paused before climbing inside. "If you do see that girl," he called back through the wind, "tell her we're still looking." The SUV engine started again, and moments later the vehicle disappeared into the storm. Jack closed the door slowly. Ranger immediately moved to the window, watching the headlights fade. Lily's voice came from the couch. That was him. Jack walked to the phone mounted on the wall near the kitchen. He lifted the receiver. Silence. No dial tone. He followed the line with his eyes toward the window where the cable ran outside through the snow. A few seconds later, he pulled on his coat again and stepped out onto the porch. Ranger watched him go. The wind nearly knocked Jack sideways as he walked along the side of the cabin toward the telephone line. He shined his flashlight upward. The cable hung loose where it had been cut cleanly. The edges were smooth, precise, not damage from the storm. Someone had done it deliberately. Jack stared at the severed wire for several seconds. Then he turned slowly back toward the cabin. The storm was no longer the only danger outside. The moment Jack Sullivan stepped back inside the cabin, the storm seemed quieter compared to the tension building in the room. Snow still hammered against the walls and roof, but now another presence pressed against the silence. The knowledge that someone out there had come looking and would likely return. Jack shut the door firmly and slid the heavy wooden bolt across it. The sound echoed through the cabin like the closing of a gate. Ranger remained by the window, watching the swirling darkness outside with unwavering focus. The German Shepherd's posture had changed entirely since the visitor left. His ears were sharpened forward, every muscle alert. The puppy Hope sat beside him, mimicking the older dog's posture with clumsy seriousness, even though her small body trembled occasionally from lingering cold. Lily Morgan watched Jack as he moved calmly across the room. The shock of Victor Kane's visit still lingered in her eyes, but something else had begun to grow there as well, a cautious trust. Jack did not look frightened or overwhelmed. Instead, his movements carried a quiet precision, the same controlled focus he once used in combat zones. Without speaking, he pulled a thick oak chair from the dining table and wedged it under the front door handle, reinforcing the wooden bolt already in place. Then he crossed the room to the large window facing the valley and dragged a heavy bookshelf across the floor until it blocked most of the glass. Books slid and thumped inside their shelves as the furniture moved. Lily watched him work. "You really think they'll come back tonight?" she asked quietly. Jack didn't look at her yet. "If they believe the tracker led here," he said, "they won't leave without checking." His voice carried no panic, only certainty. He moved toward the narrow hallway leading to the back door and repeated the process, sliding another chair beneath the handle and checking the locks carefully. Ranger followed him halfway down the hallway before stopping to listen again. Outside, the wind howled across the mountainside. Inside, the cabin was transforming into something very different from the quiet refuge it had been an hour ago. Jack opened a tall metal cabinet near the kitchen wall. Inside were neatly arranged tools, flashlights, and supplies. Beneath those shelves rested a long, narrow safe built into the floorboards. He entered a combination quickly and lifted the lid. Lily leaned slightly forward on the couch as he removed a rifle from the case. It was a bolt-action hunting rifle, well-maintained but clearly used. Jack placed it carefully on the table before retrieving 2 boxes of ammunition. Then he reached deeper into the safe and pulled out a short-barreled pump shotgun. Lily's eyes widened slightly. Jack glanced toward her for the first time. "You ever fired one of these?" he asked. Lily shook her head slowly. "No." Jack nodded once. "Then you're going to learn." He carried the shotgun to the center of the room and checked the chamber with practiced ease. Ranger returned to sit near Lily again, though his attention remained fixed on the door. Hope followed the larger dog, stumbling slightly on the wooden floor before collapsing beside him. For a moment, the puppy seemed unsure whether to sleep or watch the room like Ranger did. Lily looked down at the tiny animal and gently scratched behind its ears. Hope responded by licking her fingers enthusiastically. The simple gesture brought a faint smile to Lily's face, the first genuine expression of relief she had shown since arriving. Ranger noticed the movement and turned his head toward the puppy, giving it a brief, patient nudge with his nose. Hope immediately jumped up and began pawing playfully at the older dog's front leg. Ranger tolerated the attack with quiet dignity, eventually standing and walking slowly across the room with the puppy bouncing after him. Lily watched the two dogs with a soft laugh that surprised even her. For a brief moment, the terror of the night faded. Jack noticed it too. The tension in Lily's shoulders eased slightly as she watched Ranger patiently endure the puppy's enthusiastic clumsiness. "Guess she's decided Ranger's in charge now," Jack said quietly. Lily nodded, still smiling faintly. "Hope does that. She picks someone she trusts and sticks to them." Jack leaned the shotgun against the table and handed Lily a small cup of water before continuing his preparations. The rifle was placed near the front window. The shotgun stayed within easy reach of the couch where Lily sat. A small pistol appeared next from the safe and disappeared into the back pocket of Jack's jeans. The cabin now held the quiet readiness of a defended position. Finally, Jack returned to Lily and picked up the shotgun again. "All right," he said calmly. "Stand up." Lily hesitated, but pushed herself to her feet, leaning slightly against the couch for balance. Jack handed her the weapon carefully. "First rule," he said, "never point it at something unless you're prepared to stop it." Lily nodded, gripping the shotgun with uncertain hands. Jack stepped behind her and gently adjusted her stance. "Hold it here," he said, guiding her arms. "Stock against your shoulder. Keep your weight forward." Lily tried to steady her breathing. "And if someone comes through the door?" Jack met her eyes directly. "You aim for center mass and pull the trigger." The bluntness of the answer hung in the air. Lily swallowed but nodded again. Ranger had stopped playing with the puppy now. The German Shepherd's head lifted suddenly toward the floor near the far wall. His ears twitched once, then again. The change in the dog's posture was instant and unmistakable. Ranger stood rigid, his gaze locked toward the kitchen floor. A low growl rolled from his chest. Jack noticed immediately. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Ranger took a slow step toward the kitchen. The growl deepened. Lily held the shotgun tighter. The wind roared outside, but beneath that noise, another faint sound emerged. A dull, scraping sound, like metal against wood. Jack moved silently toward the kitchen. Ranger stood directly in front of the narrow door leading down to the basement. The growl in his chest had become a steady warning now. Jack glanced at Lily briefly. "Stay here." He reached slowly for the shotgun leaning against the table. The scraping sound came again from below the floor. Someone was inside the cabin. The growl in Ranger's chest deepened until it vibrated through the wooden floor. Jack Sullivan stood perfectly still in the dim lamplight, the shotgun held low but ready in his hands. The scraping noise beneath the cabin came again, louder this time, followed by the faint creak of old boards shifting under weight. Someone was definitely down there. Jack's mind moved quickly, slipping into the familiar calm of a tactical situation. Every sense sharpened. Ranger remained planted in front of the basement door, his ears pinned forward and his body rigid as stone. The puppy Hope crouched beside Lily on the couch, sensing the tension and pressing close against her arm. Lily Morgan stood where Jack had left her, the shotgun held awkwardly but firmly against her shoulder the way he had shown her earlier. Her breathing was fast but controlled. The fear was still there in her eyes, but something stronger had begun to replace it. Determination. Jack glanced toward her briefly. "If that door opens," he said quietly, "you stay behind the couch and keep the barrel steady." Lily nodded. "I understand." Jack stepped closer to the basement door. The wood was old pine, thick and reinforced, but the hinges rattled slightly with the movement below. Whoever was down there was trying to open it carefully. Jack slowly lifted the shotgun and positioned himself just to the side of the doorway, where anyone climbing up would have the least possible view of him. Ranger moved silently beside him, lowering his body like a coiled spring ready to strike. The scratching stopped. For several seconds there was only the sound of wind slamming snow against the cabin walls. Then the basement door shifted slightly. The latch moved with a soft click. The door creaked open just a few inches. A gloved hand appeared first, gripping the edge carefully. Then a man's head rose slowly through the opening. He wore a black tactical hood pulled low across his forehead. Even in the dim light, Jack could see the sharp lines of his face and the dark stubble along his jaw. The man was younger than Jack, probably in his early 30s, with lean features and alert eyes that moved quickly across the room. His movements were precise, almost professional. A hired operative, Jack realized instantly. Before the man could raise the pistol in his hand, Jack stepped forward and drove the barrel of the shotgun hard against the side of his head. "Drop it," Jack said calmly. The intruder froze. His eyes flicked once toward the weapon, then toward Ranger, who was now inches away, teeth bared in a silent snarl. Slowly, the man released the pistol. It clattered onto the wooden floor. Jack kicked it away and pulled the intruder fully into the room. The man did not resist. Jack forced him to his knees and quickly zip-tied his wrists behind his back, using a pair of heavy-duty restraints from his supply drawer. Ranger remained close, watching every movement with cold intensity. The intruder studied Jack carefully once the situation settled. His expression was surprisingly calm, though a thin sheen of sweat had formed across his brow despite the cold air. "You move fast," he muttered. His voice carried the faint rasp of someone used to long nights and heavy cigarettes. Jack ignored the comment and crouched in front of him. "Name." The man hesitated for a moment before answering. "Evan Cole." Jack studied him closely. Evan Cole was tall and narrow-shouldered, with short blonde hair hidden under the hood and pale blue eyes that suggested both intelligence and calculation. His hands were rough, the knuckles scarred from years of physical work, the kind of man who had spent most of his life in violent places. "Blackridge?" Jack asked. Cole gave a slight shrug. "You already know the answer." Jack glanced briefly toward Lily, who remained behind the couch with the shotgun still aimed uncertainly toward the floor. Ranger stayed between them and the prisoner like a living barrier. Jack returned his attention to Cole. "How many?" Cole's lips curled faintly. "Enough." Jack's expression didn't change. "You're the first one through the basement." Cole said nothing. Jack leaned closer, his voice dropping slightly. "Which means there are more outside." Cole's silence has stretched for several seconds before he finally exhaled slowly. "Victor Kane doesn't like loose ends." Lily flinched slightly at the name. Jack's eyes narrowed. "What were your orders?" Cole looked directly at him. "Recover the USB." His voice turned colder. "And clean the scene." The words hung heavily in the air. Lily's grip tightened on the shotgun. Jack studied the prisoner carefully, measuring the honesty in his tone. The man didn't seem frightened anymore, resigned, perhaps, but not afraid. Ranger shifted slightly, his nose close enough to Cole's face that the man could feel the dog's breath. Cole glanced at the German shepherd briefly. "That dog would tear my throat out if you let him," he said quietly. Jack did not respond. Instead, he stood and walked toward the window overlooking the snow-covered valley. The storm still raged, though visibility had improved slightly now that the wind had shifted. Somewhere beyond the trees, Victor Kane and the rest of his team were still out there, waiting, hunting. Jack reached into his shirt and removed the small USB drive Lily had given him earlier. The tiny piece of plastic suddenly felt much heavier than it should. Cole noticed the movement and smirked faintly. "You really planning to keep that?" he asked. Jack turned slowly toward him. "Why?" Cole's voice remained calm. "Because the moment Kane realizes you have it, he'll burn this whole mountain down to get it back." Lily watched Jack closely now. Something in his posture had changed again. The quiet isolation he had lived with for years was gone. In its place stood the soldier he used to be. Jack slipped the USB back into his pocket and looked toward the dark mountains rising behind the cabin. "There's a ridge about 2 miles north," he said slowly, "high enough to catch satellite signal." Lily blinked in surprise. "A satellite phone?" Jack nodded once. "Emergency unit." Cole laughed softly under his breath. "You think you'll get there before Kane finds you?" Jack met his gaze calmly. "I don't have to be faster." He glanced toward Ranger. "Just smarter." The decision had already been made. The storm had weakened slightly by the time Jack Sullivan stepped out of the cabin, though the night remained harsh and bitter across the Wyoming mountains. Snow still drifted heavily across the slopes, but the fierce wind from earlier had faded into a steady icy current sliding down from the peaks. The mountains loomed like dark giants against the pale sky, their outlines softened by blowing snow. Jack paused briefly on the porch, scanning the valley below with the practiced stillness of someone who had spent years studying terrain before moving through it. Ranger stood beside him, the German shepherd's breath forming white clouds in the cold air. The dog's posture mirrored Jack's, alert, quiet, waiting. Behind them, Lily Morgan watched from the doorway, wrapped in Jack's thick wool coat. The shotgun rested against her shoulder the way he had shown her earlier. Hope, the small puppy, remained inside, curled near the fireplace, finally asleep after the chaos of the night. Lily's voice came softly through the wind. "You're really going up there tonight?" Jack nodded once without turning. "If we wait until morning, Kane will have the whole mountain locked down." He glanced briefly toward the dark ridgeline rising behind the cabin. The ridge was steep but reachable, about 2 miles of rough terrain that climbed through thick pine forest before opening onto exposed rock near the summit. Up there, the satellite phone signal would be strong enough to transmit the files. Ranger stepped forward onto the snow-covered ground, ready to move. Lily's grip tightened slightly on the doorframe. "You'll be back?" she asked. Jack met her eyes briefly. "Keep the door locked," he said. "If anyone comes through that door and it's not me, you pull the trigger." Lily nodded slowly. Jack turned away and began moving across the field toward the tree line, Ranger running silently beside him. The climb through the forest was slow and exhausting. Snow reached nearly to Jack's knees in some places, forcing him to move carefully across the uneven ground. Ranger navigated the terrain with much greater ease, occasionally circling ahead and returning to Jack's side like a silent scout. The deeper they moved into the forest, the quieter the world became. The storm muffled distant sounds, leaving only the crunch of boots through snow and the occasional snap of frozen branches beneath Ranger's paws. Jack's shoulder muscles tightened under his coat as the slope steepened. Despite the cold, sweat formed along his back from the effort. Yet his mind remained clear, focused only on reaching the summit before Blackridge realized what he intended to do. Nearly 40 minutes later, the forest thinned. The trees gave way to an open, rocky ridge where the wind struck harder again. Jack stopped behind a large boulder and pulled the small satellite transmitter from his pack. It was an older military emergency model, scratched from years of storage, but still reliable. Ranger stood beside him, scanning the slopes below. Jack switched the unit on and waited for the signal lock to stabilize. The small screen flickered to life. coordinates locked. Signal strength rising. Jack removed the USB drive from his pocket and inserted it into the device. Data transfer began slowly. The progress bar crawled across the screen. Ranger suddenly stiffened. His head snapped toward the dark slope below the ridge. Jack noticed instantly. The dog's body had gone rigid again, ears forward, muscles tight. A warning. Jack turned his head slowly. The mountainside behind them remained quiet, but Ranger's instincts had rarely been wrong. Jack crouched lower behind the rock. The data bar reached halfway, then Ranger barked once, a single sharp warning. The rifle shot cracked through the cold air an instant later. The sound echoed violently across the ridge. Jack felt something slam against his shoulder like a hammer. The impact knocked him sideways into the snow. Ranger lunged forward at the exact same moment, slamming his body into Jack's side. The bullet had been aimed directly at Jack's chest. Instead, it tore across the outer edge of his shoulder, ripping through fabric and flesh before burying itself somewhere in the rock behind him. Jack gritted his teeth against the sudden surge of pain. Blood soaked quickly into the sleeve of his coat. Ranger stood over him now, barking fiercely into the darkness below. Jack rolled onto one knee and grabbed the transmitter. The progress bar continued moving slowly. 80%, 90. Another shot rang out from the lower slope, this one striking the rock above Jack's head and showering him with stone fragments. Jack flattened himself against the ground and shielded the transmitter with his body. "Come on," he muttered through clenched teeth. The final line flashed across the screen. Transmission complete. Jack yanked the USB free and shoved the transmitter back into his pack. Ranger continued barking toward the unseen sniper below. Jack knew better than to stay on the ridge. A trained shooter would already be adjusting position for the next shot. "Let's go," Jack said. Ranger immediately turned and ran beside him as they descended the mountain. The climb down was faster, but far more dangerous. Jack's wounded shoulder burned with every step, and the slippery snow made each movement uncertain. Behind them, another rifle shot echoed faintly through the forest, though the bullet struck harmlessly somewhere among the trees. Jack pushed forward through the dark woods until the faint outline of the cabin lights appeared far below through the branches. Ranger remained close at his side, occasionally glancing up at him as if checking that he was still moving. Miles away, in the city of Denver, Colorado, a man named Tom Reynolds sat alone in a dim apartment filled with glowing computer screens. Tom Reynolds was a former Navy SEAL like Jack, though his path after leaving the military had taken a very different direction. Tall and broad-shouldered with thick brown hair and a beard that looked perpetually half-trimmed, Tom carried the relaxed confidence of someone who had spent years solving complex problems under pressure. These days he worked as an independent cybersecurity analyst, tracking digital threats across government and corporate networks. The sudden alert from his encrypted server caught his attention immediately. He leaned forward and opened the incoming data file. As the video footage began playing across his screen, Tom's expression slowly darkened. "Jack, what the hell did you just send me?" he muttered under his breath. Within minutes he reached for his phone. There was only one place this information needed to go. Back in the mountains, Jack staggered through the final stretch of snow toward the cabin porch. Lily opened the door the moment she saw him. Her eyes widened when she noticed the blood soaking his sleeve. "You're hurt!" Jack shook his head slightly as he stepped inside. "Just a graze." Ranger followed him through the doorway and turned back towards the dark forest, still watching. Jack leaned briefly against the wall, catching his breath. The transmission had gone through, but the mountain was no longer quiet. The storm had quieted into a slow, drifting snowfall by the time Jack Sullivan finished wrapping his wounded shoulder. The blood had soaked through the sleeve of his coat earlier, but the graze itself was shallow. Pain burned along the muscle each time he moved his arm, though years of training had taught him how to ignore pain when the situation demanded it. Ranger lay on the floor beside the fireplace, watching him carefully. The German Shepherd's dark eyes followed every movement Jack made, as if measuring the strength left in his handler. Lily Morgan stood near the kitchen table, holding a lantern while Jack tightened the bandage around his shoulder. Her face had lost some of its earlier fear, replaced by something steadier now. Determination, perhaps. Outside the cabin windows, the snow fell quietly, but the silence carried a tension that neither of them could ignore. Somewhere out there, Victor Kane and the rest of Black Ridge security were still moving through the mountains. Jack finished securing the bandage and pulled his coat back on slowly. Lily studied him with concern. "You should stay inside," she said quietly. Jack shook his head. "If they reach the cabin, we lose the advantage." He walked to the window and scanned the dark shapes of the surrounding trees. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by forest on 3 sides, with a narrow trail leading toward an abandoned structure about 50 yards away. The old horse barn had been built decades earlier by Jack's father, when the land was still used for cattle and horses. Time and winter storms had worn the building down to a skeletal shape of dark wood and leaning beams, but the structure still stood. Jack's eyes lingered on it for a moment. A plan was already forming. Lily noticed the direction of his gaze. "The barn?" she asked. Jack nodded slowly. "If Kane's people move in, they'll search the cabin first." He turned toward her, "But they won't expect resistance out there." Ranger stood immediately when Jack moved toward the door. The dog's loyalty was absolute. Hope remained asleep by the fire, too young to understand the danger gathering outside. Lily stepped closer. "What do you want me to do?" Jack looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Stay here. Lock the door." Lily shook her head firmly. "No." Her voice was quiet but unwavering. "I'm not hiding while you fight for me." Jack studied her expression. The exhaustion and bruises still marked her face, but something stronger lived behind her eyes now. She had survived too much already to retreat again. Finally, Jack nodded once. "Then stay behind me." Minutes later, the two of them moved quietly across the snow toward the old barn. Ranger ran slightly ahead, his nose close to the ground as he scanned for unfamiliar scent. The barn loomed ahead like a dark silhouette against the pale snowfield. Broken wooden boards rattled softly in the cold wind. Inside, the air smelled of old hay and dry timber. The interior was mostly empty except for a few rotting stalls and a narrow loft above the main floor. Jack positioned Lily behind a thick support beam near the wall. "If someone comes through that door," he said softly, "wait until they're fully inside." Lily nodded, gripping the shotgun with both hands. Ranger crouched beside Jack near the wide barn entrance. The dog's breathing slowed into a focused rhythm. Minutes passed in silence. Then footsteps approached across the snow. 2 figures emerged from the darkness outside the barn. One of them was Victor Kane. Even in the faint moonlight, Jack recognized his tall frame and composed posture. Kane walked with the same calm confidence as before, his long coat moving slightly in the cold wind. Beside him was another man, broader and heavier than Evan Cole had been earlier. The man's face was partially hidden beneath a thick beard and a wool cap pulled low across his forehead. His name, Jack would later learn, was Marcus Doyle. Doyle had the heavy shoulders and blunt movements of someone who had spent most of his life in physical confrontations. His thick beard and scarred knuckles hinted at years of violent work. Kane paused just outside the barn entrance and scanned the interior with sharp gray eyes. "He's close," Kane said quietly. Doyle grunted. "Then let's finish this." The two men stepped inside. The moment Doyle crossed the threshold, Jack pulled the trigger. The shotgun blast exploded through the barn like thunder. Doyle collapsed instantly, the force throwing him backward into a pile of broken boards. Kane reacted with remarkable speed, diving behind a wooden stall as splinters shattered around him. Jack pumped the shotgun and moved forward. Kane rolled from behind the stall and charged straight at him instead of retreating. The two men collided violently near the center of the barn. Kane was faster than Jack expected. His fist struck Jack's injured shoulder with brutal precision, sending a surge of pain through his arm. Jack staggered backward but swung the shotgun like a club, striking Kane across the ribs. The impact forced Kane to step back, though his expression remained cold and controlled. "You should have stayed out of this," Kane said calmly. Jack answered by lunging forward again. The fight became brutal and close. Fists slammed against bone and muscle as the two men struggled across the barn floor. Kane fought with the cold efficiency of someone trained for years in controlled violence. Jack matched him blow for blow, despite the injury burning through his shoulder. Kane finally managed to slam Jack against a wooden post, driving the air from his lungs. He raised a knife that had appeared suddenly in his hand. Before the blade could strike, Ranger launched forward. The German shepherd slammed into Kane's side with a furious snarl, jaws clamping down on his arm. Kane shouted in pain and kicked violently at the dog. The blow struck Ranger hard in the ribs. The dog yelped and tumbled across the hay-covered floor. Jack's vision flashed with anger. He drove forward and tackled Kane to the ground. The knife slid across the floor as the two men struggled. Jack pinned Kane's arms beneath his weight and forced him face down against the frozen boards. Kane stopped resisting. He looked up slowly with the same cold expression he had worn all night. Jack raised his fist for the final strike. "Jack!" Lily's voice echoed through the barn. He froze. Lily stepped forward from behind the beam, the shotgun still raised but her eyes pleading. "Don't," she said softly. Jack stared down at Kane for a long moment before finally lowering his hand. Kane exhaled slowly as the tension eased from the room. Morning arrived slowly over the Wyoming mountains, the kind of pale winter dawn where light seemed to seep into the valley rather than rise. Snow still covered the ground in a thick white blanket, though the storm that had raged through the night had finally passed. The sky above the ridge carried a faint band of silver where the sun struggled to break through the heavy clouds. The old barn stood quiet again, its weathered boards creaking softly in the cold wind. Inside, Victor Kane remained pinned against the wooden floor where Jack Sullivan held him. The tension from the fight still lingered in the air like the fading echo of thunder. Jack's breathing had slowed, but his muscles remained tight, the instinct to finish the fight still pressing at the back of his mind. Lily Morgan stood several steps away, the shotgun lowered now, but still in her hands. Ranger lay on the ground a few feet away, breathing heavily but alert despite the pain from his ribs. The German shepherd's chest rose and fell slowly, his dark eyes fixed on Jack as if waiting for the next command. Kane's pale gray eyes studied Jack calmly. Even pinned to the ground, the man carried the same controlled composure he had shown all night. "You're making a mistake," Kane said quietly. Jack did not respond. The distant sound of engines rolling across frozen ground reached them a few seconds later. Jack's head lifted slightly. Lily turned toward the barn entrance as the noise grew louder. Within minutes, two dark vehicles pushed through the snowy field toward the barn. One carried the blue markings of the county sheriff's department. The other was a black federal SUV with government plates. The vehicles stopped sharply outside. Doors opened, and several figures stepped into the snow with careful urgency. The first man through the barn doorway wore a thick sheriff's coat and a wide hat dusted with snow. Sheriff Alan Porter was a broad, middle-aged man with weathered skin and heavy shoulders built from years working outdoors. His thick mustache was speckled with gray, and his calm, steady eyes reflected a man who had spent decades dealing with difficult situations without panic. 2 uniformed deputies followed close behind him. Behind them entered a woman wearing a dark federal jacket marked with the letters FBI across the chest. Special Agent Claire Donovan moved with quiet authority. She was tall and lean, with sharp features and short auburn hair tucked neatly behind her ears. Her expression was focused but composed, the look of someone trained to step into dangerous scenes without hesitation. She took in the situation quickly: the injured dog, the destroyed boards, the body of Marcus Doyle, and Jack holding Victor Kane to the ground. Sheriff Porter raised his hand slightly. "Easy now," he said calmly. "Looks like things got lively out here." Jack slowly released his grip on Kane and stood. Kane rolled onto his side but made no attempt to escape. Agent Donovan stepped forward immediately and knelt beside him, snapping a pair of handcuffs around his wrists with efficient precision. Kane smiled faintly as she pulled him upright. "I was wondering when you'd arrive," he said calmly. Donovan ignored the comment and nodded toward one of the deputies. "Take him outside." As Kane was escorted from the barn, Sheriff Porter approached Jack. "You the one who sent that data up the line?" Jack nodded once. Porter let out a slow breath. "Son, that file lit up half the federal network before sunrise." Agent Donovan stepped back toward them once Kane was secured outside. "The evidence your friend transmitted from the Ridge is already being reviewed in Denver," she said. "Black Ridge Security and Grayson Biotech are both under federal investigation as we speak." Lily stepped forward slightly, her voice uncertain. "So, it's over?" Donovan's expression softened slightly. "For them, yes." She glanced toward the sheriff's deputies loading Kane into the SUV. "For you, it might just be beginning." Several hours later, the mountain valley finally grew quiet again. The vehicles disappeared down the snow-covered road carrying Victor Kane and the evidence that would dismantle the entire Black Ridge operation. Federal agents remained briefly to collect statements and document the scene before leaving as well. By afternoon, the only signs of the long night were the deep tire tracks in the snow and the broken boards scattered inside the barn. Weeks passed. Winter slowly loosened its grip on the mountains as the sun climbed higher each day. Snow melted gradually from the fields surrounding the cabin, revealing patches of green grass beneath the white crust. Spring arrived gently in the valley, bringing new life to the quiet land. Lily Morgan remained near the cabin during those weeks. The federal investigation required her testimony, but she also chose to stay for another reason. She had begun writing again. Each morning she sat on the porch with a notebook balanced on her knee, documenting everything that had happened. The corruption inside Grayson Biotech, the whistleblower Daniel Reeves, the evidence that nearly cost her life. But she also wrote about something else, the man who had chosen to help her when he had every reason to walk away. Jack Sullivan had begun traveling into town once a week to meet with a therapist recommended by the VA hospital. Years of quiet isolation had built walls inside him that even he had not fully understood until recently. The process was slow and uncomfortable at times, but it was a beginning. Ranger healed steadily as well. The veterinarian confirmed that the rib fracture would mend with time and rest. During those weeks, hope rarely left Ranger's side. The puppy followed the older dog everywhere, mimicking his movements and learning from his calm discipline. By the time spring sunlight finally warmed the valley, Hope had grown noticeably larger, her ears finally beginning to stand upright like a true German shepherd. One quiet morning, Jack stepped out onto the wide field behind the cabin, holding a bright red ball in his hand. The grass had begun to grow again, soft and green beneath the sunlight. Ranger trotted beside him with his tail lifted proudly, his stride strong once more. Hope bounced ahead in clumsy excitement. Jack threw the ball across the field. Ranger sprinted after it immediately while Hope chased him with enthusiastic determination. Lily watched from the porch, smiling quietly as the two dogs raced across the open meadow. Jack stood in the sunlight, breathing in the warm spring air that carried the scent of pine and earth. For the first time in a long while, the mountains felt peaceful again. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder or bright light. Sometimes they come quietly, in the middle of a storm, through the loyalty of a dog, the courage of a stranger, and the simple choice to help someone in need. On that frozen night in the mountains, Jack believed he was alone in the world. But God often works through the paths we never expect. A frightened girl found shelter, a wounded soldier found purpose again, and two dogs reminded them both that loyalty and love can still survive even in the coldest storms. Maybe that is how God shows us that no life crosses our path by accident. Every act of kindness, every moment of courage, and every hand we extend to someone in pain becomes part of a greater story we may not fully understand. In our everyday lives, we all face storms of our own. Some are loud and visible, while others are quiet struggles carried in the heart. But sometimes the smallest act of compassion can become the beginning of someone else's miracle. If this story touched your heart today, take a moment to share it with someone who might need hope. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, because we love seeing how these stories bring people together from around the world. And if you believe that kindness still matters in this world, please subscribe to the channel so more stories of courage, loyalty, and faith can reach others. May God watch over you, bless your home, protect your family, and bring peace to your heart wherever you are today.